The spinal cord. The spinal cord begins at the occipital bones and extends down to between first and second lumbar vertebrae. It extends from foramen magnum to the end point of the spinal cord that is called as conus medullaris. And what is filum terminale? It is the pial extension starting from the conus medullaris and connects it to the coccyx. The three membranes of the spinal cord, like brain, are dura, arachnoid, and pia mater. The pia mater is closely applied to the spinal cord. The epidural space, what does it contain? The epidural space in the spinal cord contains adipose tissue and a network of blood vessels. And what does the subarachnoid space contains? The subarachnoid space contains CSF in it. What is denticulate ligament? Denticulate ligaments are the ligaments that stabilize the cord in its position, and they extend from the pia laterally to the side. The dural sac ends at the vertebral level of second sacral vertebra. So a spinal cord ending at L2, the dural sac ending at S2. This is the internal structure of the spinal cord. The white matter surrounding the gray matter. The gray matter is H-shape or butterfly shape. This is the anterior horn. This is the posterior of the gray matter, and this is the lateral horn. Similarly, the white matter is divided into three: the anterior funiculus, the lateral, and the posterior funiculus. So what is the difference between the gray matter and the white matter? The gray matter is unmyelinated. The white matter is unmyelinated. This is the dorsal root, the back you see in the blue, and this is the ventral root, the dorsal ventral root arising from the anterior horn, and the posterior root arising from the posterior horn. The dorsal root contains sensory fibers, the ventral root contains the motor fibers, and the dorsal root has a swelling on it. It's called a dorsal root ganglion. And what is a ganglion? A ganglion is a neuron which is outside the central nervous system. See that this ganglion is outside the spinal cord. Then these two, dorsal and the ventral root, unite to form the spinal cord, spinal nerves. And these spinal nerves, anterior and posterior spinal nerves, are the mixed nerve. They carry both sensory and motor fibers. Both dorsal root and the ventral root contains three types of fibers: the visceral, the somatic, and the autonomic fibers. The spinal cord stops growing in length at about age of 4, but the bones keeps on growing. So the level of spinal cord and vertebrae is different. So which is like this. In the upper cervical region, the level is same. In the lower cervical region, the spinal cord is one level higher. In the upper thoracic area, the spinal cord is 2 levels higher. In the lower thoracic area, spinal cord is 2 to 3 levels higher. In the lumbar region, it is the T10 to T12, and in sacrum it's T12 to L1, and the coccyx is at the L1 or L2, that is the spinal coccygeal level is L1 and 2. Important landmark is that nipple is at thoracic 4, T4, and umbilicus is at T10. Although the spinal cord ends at lumbar 2 vertebrae, but the corresponding nerves, the spinal nerve, arise from their corresponding vertebrae, and they travel in the space between the spinal cord and the vertebral canal, and these nerve, they form a bundle of nerve. This is known as cauda equina. There are two enlargements in the spinal cord, at cervical level and at the lumbosacral level. The cervical enlargement is at C4 to T1, and the lumbosacral enlargement is between L2 to S3. The blood supply of the spinal cord. There is one anterior spinal artery and two posterior spinal arteries, the right and the left spinal artery. Where does it arise from? It arises from the vertebral arteries near its end point. The vertebral arteries go up in the brain and they unite to form the basilar artery, and before that they give two anterior spinal arteries. These two anterior spinal arteries, they descend down on the front surface of the medulla. They unite to form one single anterior spinal artery. And where does the vertebral arteries arise? The vertebral arteries arise from the subclavian arteries, and they go up to form the basilar artery or vertebro-basilar system of arteries. The posterior spinal artery can often originate from posterior inferior cerebellar arteries. The major contribution to the arterial blood supply of the spinal cord below the cervical region comes from the radially arranged posterior and anterior radicular arteries. These are the branches of the aorta. The spinal nerves. There are 31 spinal nerves and there are 8 cervical nerves. The first cervical nerve arises between the occiput and the first cervical vertebra. The second nerve exists between the cervical 1 vertebra and the laminae of the cervical 2 vertebrae. The rest of the cervical nerve, they arise above the corresponding cervical vertebrae. This is important because the other nerves, the thoracic and lumbar nerve, they arise below the corresponding vertebrae. So these are the cervical nerves, CA3 to C8, they arise above the corresponding cervical vertebra. The cervical 8 pair exit from the inferior intervertebral foramen between C7 and T1 vertebrae. There are 12 thoracic segments, 5 lumbar and 5 sacral. All of them arrive below the corresponding vertebrae. This is a section of the spinal cord with the butterfly H-shaped gray matter, which is unmyelinated, and the white matter surrounding that. This is the anterior horn, posterior, anterior for the motor, posterior for the sensory nerve, and this is the lateral horn, which is present in the thoracic and lumbar region, and this has got the preganglionic fibers for the autonomic nervous system or sympathetic nervous system. This is the anterior median fissure, and here is the central canal of the spinal cord in which flows the cerebrospinal fluid. And where is the anterior and posterior gray commissure? The gray matter in front and behind this central canal is the anterior and posterior gray commissure. They are the connecting fiber, the decussating fibers. The types of bundles of axons in the white matter. They are funiculus, fasciculus, tract and pathway. So what is a funiculus? Funiculus is a morphological term to describe a large group of nerve fibers which are located in a given area, like posterior funiculus. What is a fasciculus? Within a funiculus, a group of fibers from diverse origin which share a common features are arranged in small bundles of axon. This is known as fasciculus. And what is a tract? A tract is a group of nerve fiber which usually have the same origin, destination and course, and also have similar functions. For example, cortico-spinal tracts or spinothalamic tract. What is a pathway? A pathway refers to entire neuronal circuit responsible for a specific function, and that includes the nuclei and tract which are associated with the function. For example, the spinothalamic pathway includes the cell bodies of origin, the dorsal root ganglia, their axons as they project through the dorsal root, synapse in the spinal cord, and projection of the second and third order neuron across the white commissure which ascend to the thalamus, and that is the spinothalamic tract to the end. A few words about the anterior horn cells. The anterior horn cells have the lower motor neuron nuclei. They are located in the ventral horn, and they contain predominantly the motor nuclei consisting of alpha, beta and gamma motor neurons, and they are found at all levels of the spinal cord. The motor neurons are the final common pathway of the motor system, and they innervate the visceral and skeletal muscles. The interior structure of the spinal cord. The laminae of the gray matter. The rexed laminae. The gray matter has 10 different laminae. Laminae 1 to laminae 10, and there are 4 important structures in that: the substantia gelatinosa, the nucleus proprius, the dorsal nucleus of Clark, and the intermediate lateral nucleus. The substantia gelatinosa. Substantia gelatinosa is in the laminae 2 of the gray matter of his spinal cord. It is one point, that is with the nucleus proprius being the other, where the first order neuron of the spinothalamic tract, the synapse. Substantia gelatinosa is concerned with pain, and it has many mu and kappa opioid receptors. Presynaptically and postsynaptically, they are found on the nerve cells, and they can be targeted on managing the pain of distal region. C-type of fibers also terminate at this layer. They convey slowly conducting, poorly localized pain sensation. However, some A-delta fibers, which carry the fast localized pain sensation, also terminate in the substantia gelatinosa. The homologous substantia gelatinosa in the medulla is the spinal trigeminal nerve. The nucleus proprius. The nucleus proprius is a layer of spinal cord adjacent to the substantia gelatinosa in layer 3-4 laminae, and is found in the gray matter in all levels of spinal cord. It constitutes the first synapse of the spinothalamic tract, carrying pain and temperature sensation from the peripheral nerves. The cells in this nucleus project to the deeper laminae of the spinal cord, to the posterior column nuclei, to the midbrain, thalamus, and to the hypothalamus. The rexed lamina 3, 4, and 5, they make up the nucleus proprius. The Clark's column. The Clark's column are a group of interneurons in the lamina 7, that is also known as intermediate zone of the spinal cord, and is mainly located from T1 to L3 or 4 and is important structure for proprioception. Clark's column are concerned with proprioception, and it begins caudally at the level of third lumbar nerve and reaches its maximum size opposite the 12th thoracic nerve. So it is smaller at the lower level and increases in size as it goes up. These Clark's column cells have characteristically present coarse nasal granules and have characteristic eccentric nuclei. Zonal projection, they give rise to the dorsal spinocerebellar tract, which ascend ipsilaterally through the spinal cord, and they end as mossy fiber in the ipsilateral cerebellum. The Clark's column is a major relay center for unconscious proprioception. Sensory information from muscle spindles and tendon organs is carried to the spinal cord, including the cells in the Clark's column, and then to the cerebral cortex through the posterior spinothalamic tract. In Friedreich ataxia, there is degeneration of dorsal nucleus of Clark as well as other proprioceptive spinal tract. This leads to ataxia, dysarthria, muscle weakness or paralysis, and skeletal deficits. The intermediate lateral cell columns. The intermediate lateral cell column in the gray matter of spinal cord exists in Rexet lamina 7 from T1 to L2 and mediate the entire sympathetic innervation of the body and contains the autonomic motor neurons that give rise to preganglionic fibers of the sympathetic nervous system.